see such a big group. It's exciting. And this is a fascinating topic. This is something that I taught at another school in the area, and I didn't think that it would draw very many people. The class was actually called The Philosophy of Death and Dying, and I ended up getting far more people registered for that class than for the classes that they actually had to take, because what I was teaching was an elective. So what that tells me is that this is more interesting to people than you would initially think. We just don't talk about it very often. So, just so you know who I am, a lot of you already know me, but I guess I will apologize for being redundant then. But my name is Sarah Geis, and I'm the Associate Director of the Gordon Lewis Center for Christian Thought and Culture. And what we try to do, this is an outreach organization that is a companion to the Apologetics and Ethics degree here at Denver Seminary. So the degree program serves Denver Seminary students, and then the center is what we try to do to be outward focused in order to actually become a resource for the community. So if you know of anyone else who would be interested, it's not too late. They can show up. So this is a wonderful group, and I think we'll have a good time. But what I do is I'm an associate, what do they even call this? It's adjunct faculty, but affiliate faculty. There's a formal name for it. And I teach apologetics and ethics classes here. I also teach philosophy and ethics classes at the Community College of Aurora. So I just teach all the time, and I love it. And this is a good way to get a very different group of people than I normally would teach. So welcome. For those of you who already registered, the registration includes the book, so that's how we knew how many to order. But there is a sign-up sheet somewhere around here if you haven't registered yet, so just pass that around. It's a yellow sheet, I think it's right here. So make sure that your name gets on that, and then let us know how many books you need. So that should just kind of make its way around. And then we will quickly get some ideally before next time. Okay. One of the ways that I teach, just so you know, I'm going to be trading off with Dr. Grotheis, who is the head of the Apologetics and Ethics Department and the head of the Gordon Lewis Center. We're going to trade off over the course of this class. And both of us are interested in discussion too. So even if we seem like we're just plowing through a whole bunch of material, you can still talk. Even if it looks like you're going to be interrupting, that's fine, because part of what this is designed to do is to serve you, and if there's something that you need us to slow down for or want to focus on, this is not the sort of class that's designed to just power through information and send you home confused and bewildered. It's instead the kind of class that we have a lot of information ready, but we would rather be able to allow the people in here to determine how fast we go, how slow we go, maybe if we even cover some things at all that we may not have time for, because there may be something else that you want to camp on for a longer period of time. So, all that to say, if I don't explicitly ask for questions, or if I don't explicitly look at you hoping for questions or comments, just do it anyway. Just jump in there. All right. I'm going to read a passage from Psalm, it's Psalm 43:5. And this is extremely pertinent to what we're going to be talking about. This says, "Why, my soul, are you downcast? Why so disturbed within me? Put your hope in God, for I will yet praise him, my Savior and my God." The fascinating thing about that is that this is an assumption of the soul component to a human. This is probably David, who is preaching to his soul. He is actually most likely telling his soul, which is his inner self, his spiritual dimension, what to feel. He's chastising himself in a sense for feeling a a certain way that is not in alignment with reality. So the reason I'm starting out with this is because already in Scripture, I wanted to just jump in showing that in the Bible, the assumption is that we are what's called a dualistic type of being. We have a body, which is our physical, material self, and then the soul, which is our spiritual, our immaterial, which is non-physical self. So if we take the Bible seriously at all, then that should be an important thing to explore. If you don't particularly take the Bible all that seriously, then if we are able to show that that's accurate in the real world, that that's actually the best explanation for the human person, then it should give you more reason to take the Bible seriously. So it goes both ways. It's a situation where however you start out oriented towards Scripture, it should either confirm that or cause you to believe more of what is said in here. Because what you'll find the more you study, at first it seems just like supernatural mythical language, and then the more you actually study it, it's shockingly true. It seems to be something that is objectively, meaning in the real world, outside of what you'd hear a preacher say on Sunday, outside of that world, it's still true, and it lines up. So that's what we're going to explore for this entire 7 weeks. And then we'll end up talking about death, which is the logical next step. If we have a soul, if the person survives death in some way, obviously not your body, but if there's something in you that persists and carries on after death, then all of a sudden, life after death should put this life in a different light. It should cause this life to have a perspective and have a certain orientation toward it that you didn't have before. So let's go ahead and jump in. All right, what is the soul? This is on your outline. Historically, it has not meant anything religious. It's literally just meant whatever animates you, whatever makes you go. It's the difference between a corpse and a living being. It's literally the animating property of a being. So in that sense, historically, animals have always been thought to have souls until recently. It seems strange to a lot of you, but in that sense, if you define soul strictly in that way, animals are animated by something. Meaning, there's a difference, like I said before, between a dead body and a living creature. That life piece is what historically has been considered to be the soul. So, even though, as of yet, this is still pretty general, and there's not any kind of religious overtones or connotations that would make anybody particularly uncomfortable, unless you don't believe in the immaterial at all, then right here, there is a world full of souls. And we haven't yet gotten to the point where we differentiate types. We're not going to do that today, but I at least want you to be aware that if there is something there that animates the body, it is thought that that is not immaterial, that it involves the material. When I say this, and I'm going to use these terms a lot, immaterial, immaterial. Material is the physical world. It is your skin, your bones, your blood, your muscles, and the ground you walk on, those sorts of things. The immaterial is whatever is not reducible to matter, atoms, dirt, those sorts of things. You can't weigh it. You can't get it wet. You can't take its temperature. That's stuff in the immaterial world. So what is doubted today is the presence of that immaterial category entirely. So that's what we're going to continually, for a few weeks, we're going to try to show that it actually makes far more sense for there to be an immaterial world and an immaterial sort of stuff, such as the soul, than it does to suggest that there is no such thing as the immaterial. That actually makes less sense in the long run when you're trying to explain reality. So, most often today, that's what it refers to. If someone says the soul, if someone is talking to you about the soul or says something along those lines, they're just meaning, most of the time, the immaterial part. Now, it tends to be over-spiritualized too, but what everyone has in common, at least, is that they're referring to that immaterial world, or immaterial part. J.P. Moreland, who's the writer of this book that you're going to be working through, it's an excellent book. He actually separates out more than 4 different parts of the immaterial person, but I just wrote down 4 that I think are the most obvious. One of them is the intellect, which is your reasoning capacities. It's what you do when you construct an argument in your head, when you try to persuade something or someone that you know of something that they don't want to believe or they don't want to do. It can be as simple as trying to persuade them to eat something for dinner that they don't like. But that's the intellect. The desire, any sort of desire that you have, does sometimes involve the intellect, but not necessarily. It's just what you want, what you long for. The emotions, sad, happy, angry, all those sorts of things. Boredom, which you could be feeling now. Being overwhelmed, which you also could be feeling now. Those sorts of things are emotions. Then you have sensations, which are a lot more direct than emotions. Those are hot, cold, headache, things like that, that you don't necessarily immediately reflect on, but then you can later, and that involves the intellect, which then may involve desires to maybe, if you have a headache, go get an Advil, or something like that. But this is all a part, all of these things are a part of what we're trying to defend as the immaterial part of the self. So, in other words, you don't go into the doctor to get your desires checked. You can go into the psychologist or the psychiatrist, depending on how severe and whether or not this is a chemical problem, but you can go in and have this person help you reason through your problems, help you to figure out how to feel rightly. And that's something that we don't like to think about either, that sometimes your emotions may not be accurate emotions. They may not be actually rightly oriented toward reality. So when we're talking about going into the doctor to get your desires maybe reoriented or get your emotions recalibrated, it's not someone actually putting you under the scalpel and taking out a part of you, or maybe giving you an implant, maybe a love implant, or a compassion implant. That doesn't happen. You actually have to, inside yourself, use the advice that's given to you and really do it largely on your own. That doesn't take into account the influence of, as Christians, we believe the Holy Spirit helps, that's part of sanctification. But still, for the purposes of this argument, it's not a medically, surgically altered state. So I hope at this point you kind of get the distinction between what goes on physically and then what goes on immaterially. And another word for that may be spiritually, because that is a word that has far more religious connotations to it, religious baggage, really, than just simply the immaterial. But they are actually more often than not used as synonyms. So if there is an immaterial world, then that would be the candidate for the spiritual world, if it's not physical, because that's what we have historically meant, that's what Scripture means, I have not encountered any other way of talking about the spiritual realm that doesn't literally just mean the immaterial world. Okay, so all of these four things, the intellect, the desires, the emotions, sensations, they're all examples of consciousness, which is another term. You're going to hear so many words that mean the same thing that your head's going to spin. Consciousness is the immaterial part of what goes on in the human self. Consciousness is why you can regain consciousness. You can lose consciousness. When you die, you're not conscious. Consciousness is defined more accurately, and J.P. Moreland talks about this in another book that he wrote. But consciousness is better defined by examples of it, like the experience of regaining consciousness after surgery. You slowly start to notice more things. So consciousness is, for the purposes of this class, going to be used as a synonym too. Immaterial, consciousness, spiritual realm, these are all the same kind of thing. Okay. If there is such a thing as consciousness and it's immaterial, then there are two explanations for it. And these are the two primary options that people in our culture tend to fall into. The first one is that it is immaterial, which is what we're going to be arguing for in this class, which is that it's related at least to the soul, and probably, it being consciousness, it probably has something to do with the soul, and at most, it is equivalent to the soul. So your soul, whatever that is then going to involve the intellect, desires, emotions, sensations, which is interesting, because we tend to think of the soul as this hyper-spiritual world that doesn't have anything to do with knowledge, with reason, anything like that. So this is actually a much fuller picture of what is going on with us inside, what the spiritual dimension, what the spiritual realm actually desires of us, or what it means to be a spiritually mature person. It doesn't just mean you're hyper-emotional, or you, I don't know, break into tears at the slightest sappy story on the radio, on K-Love. I don't know about you, but I feel manipulated whenever they try to make you cry with certain stories. So that doesn't mean that you're spiritual. It may just mean you're a sap. And if the spiritual realm, if the soul involves the intellect, then we have to ask ourselves, have we been neglecting that? Have we been neglecting thinking rightly about who we are, what we're made to be? Going back to David in the Psalms, when he was preaching to himself, the reason that he was asking his soul, why so downcast, is because he was depressed, he was despairing. He was actually in a period there where he was being hunted by Saul, who was trying to kill him. And he was, I don't know how long he was hiding, but it was probably a very long time, and he was most likely starting to lose hope. But what he was telling himself was, despite the feelings of hopelessness, he knew in his head, he knew in his mind, which is part of the soul, that you actually have no right, David, to be despairing here. You understandably are sad, but ultimately, God, who is the creator and sustainer of the universe, is still in control. He still knows where you are, he knows the exact situation, and he knows when it's going to end and how it's going to end and what he's going to do with you afterward. So that's why he was preaching to himself. He was saying, I feel this way, and yet I know that the way that I'm feeling is not justified. So that's an example of the fully orbed soul experience. That was all immaterial. He wasn't sitting there having some sort of strange physical experience that was working through this. This was all immaterial, all inside of him. So this view that is, we have an inner life or an immaterial life, and in a physical body, both of those two things, that's called dualism. And it literally just means two-ism. That's what the word means. So there are two parts to the human person. Saying that there are two parts to the human person, though, sometimes freaks people out. And the reason is because, especially today, I've encountered this probably more than most of you have, because it's more in the nerdy philosophy world where we toss these things around. But a lot of people today are afraid of dualism in general. They are afraid that if we say that there's a distinction or a difference between the soul and the body, then all of a sudden what's going to happen is we're not going to care about the body anymore. We're going to let it go. We're going to just focus on spiritual stuff all the time, look for sappy stories, maybe try to get into some kind of weird religious trance where we seem really spiritual because we just entered another realm, which is probably just strange pacification of things to no real helpful end. But what ends up happening is people are afraid, if we acknowledge this distinction, that the body doesn't matter all of a sudden. And that's not the case. That's not what we have to worry about. This is drawing a distinction, but you're not saying that they're not related. You're not saying that one's better than the other, or one's more important than the other. That is up to you, whether or not you ultimately hold to that. But in the beginning, the dualism itself does not tell you what's better and what's higher order, more important, and what's lower order and less important. So don't let that worry you. If you've maybe read a book that cautions against dualism, it's probably overreacting. So be aware. Okay, any questions so far? Nothing. All right.
Well,
Your
there
souls
are
are
other
true.
positions besides just dualism, or what would you call someone who doesn't believe there's a soul?
We'll get to that just in 1 second.
But there's also
That is,
like body, soul, spirit.
right, that is a distinction that you could even throw in these four. Intellect, desires, emotions, sensations. You could even, because J.P. Moreland does. He says the spirit is in there. I don't hold to that. I think that to tease apart the soul, the spiritual dimension, and the spirit is to suggest something that at least the Bible doesn't say anything about. It doesn't seem to say that we have this hyper-religious part of us that's over here, and then we have hunger, thirst, academic interests, emotional interests over here. I think that they're together, and I think that the soul is what is the conscious part of all of those things. But that, even for the sake of what we're doing here, the two main divisions, which are dualism, and then what we'll get into, which is physicalism, which is the people who don't believe in a soul, you don't even have to get as specific yet as what goes on in the immaterial part of us. What exactly is it broken into? That's kind of the next stage. So that would be more of a dualist in-house debate, if that makes sense. Any other questions before we blast on farther? Yes?
I think it's interesting that you've included the sensations, because in a lot of the ways these are synapses firing. You know, just literally an automatic reaction to our environment.
I'm really glad you brought that up. What happens when you have a pain in your foot? What do you think?
Ouch.
Ouch, yeah. And then what do you think?
I need a band-aid.
Right, or you try to figure out what happened, what's wrong. So there's a subtle distinction here. The synapse fire, and then you think about it.
So it's the thought and the intellectual or emotional reaction
It can be,
to
but
that, because you know, if your foot hurts, like if you touch a hot thing, you don't think about it, you know, react, and it's reflexive.
you can. And what I would say is there are probably some sensations that stay at the level of synapse firing.
So this is really the reaction to, you know,
It's
what
more
you're
of a
doing
conscious-
with a sensation.
It could be, but I wouldn't even push it that far. I would just say it's simply your awareness, your mental awareness of it. So there may be some situations where if you burn, I don't know, if you feel cold and you're asleep, you may not necessarily be conscious of that. You may just react to the cold and maybe put on another blanket or something like that. So I think there are some sensations that stay at the level of the neurological or the neurophysical. But most of them, as long as we're conscious, I think are actually, there's something else going on that is triggered by the neurological firing, and then that we actually reflect on very briefly. And then we can push it in a either desire or intellect reflection direction, something like that. So I'm really glad you brought that up. That's a great question and comment. Yes?
Would you say it's fair to say that we're talking about perception more than sensation? Like our awareness of the result of the synapses
You
firing?
could. I think that would just be a different sense. That would be more more immediately mental, more immediately conscious than, you couldn't necessarily spot a perception on a brain scan, but you can spot feelings, immediate physical sensations on a brain scan. You can't, we're not so sophisticated to where we can say, oh, this person felt hot. But if the person tells you, that was when I was feeling hot, then you can spot a certain thing happening on the brain scan. But with perceptions, that's kind of a vague term, but most of the time, that's more of a mental process that I don't think we can, at this point, spot on a brain scan. So, does that make sense? Sort of? But these are all just examples. I mean, these are not divisions that I would necessarily want you to worry about at this stage. But those are divisions that most people tend to say are more often than not best described as the immaterial component. Yes, ma'am?
Plus, they're probably not that clearly defined in a living person.
Right.
There's no straight line. Body, soul.
It's very hard to know what is brain and what is soul, or what is immaterial. But don't let that scare you, because having a difficulty teasing two things apart, having a difficulty telling twins apart, doesn't mean there aren't twins. So that doesn't mean that all of a sudden you have one thing just because there's gray area or a fuzzy line there. But that's a good point. Okay. The second explanation then, this is the anti-dualist position. This is strictly physical, or that the soul, the consciousness, the immaterial is actually just a myth. The immaterial does not exist, the soul does not exist. Consciousness is strictly what happens in your brain. This is literally just matter, atoms, the physical world. That's it. It's sometimes called materialism. There are philosophers who like to keep those terms separate, but most of the time there's so much overlap that I'm using them as the same thing. So materialism doesn't mean accumulating wealth. It doesn't mean being consumeristic and greedy in this case. Sometimes it does, but not tonight. Tonight it just means only believing that matter exists. So these are people who, if they are religious at all, if they do have any sort of beliefs about the religious world, it would strictly be as a tradition that they enjoy. If there would be no actual reality to it apart from the physical world, because that wouldn't make sense. It would not make any sense to say that the world is physical and what a religion teaches is true about the immaterial world. That's a complete contradiction. So you will have people in this camp that are trying to bridge the gap, that are trying to say, well, maybe we are all just matter, but it doesn't really matter all that much. We can still be good Christians, we can still be very religious people, but I would caution you to ask, especially after you go through this class, ask yourself, does that really work? Is that really possible? Or are you, in trying to be a physicalist, in trying to defend the view that the physical is all that exists, are you actually just getting rid of your right to believe in anything else outside of this physical world? And I do not think it works, but you'll encounter it, I think, once you're aware of it. You'll start to spot it more. Okay. So, let's move on. Here is the biggest question that I want to focus on today, since this is more of a stage-setting class than it is getting into the meat of the arguments themselves. So often, we hear things like, well, this is just a matter of blind faith. This is not something that you can prove. This is really the stuff that needs to occupy the time of scientists. This is a science issue, or the brain is a science issue, and then all you soul believers, that's your blind religious end of things. And you can just go and have a good time doing whatever you do with the soul, but don't try to tell us that it actually exists or is knowable or is provable. So that's the kind of language that you're probably fairly familiar with. Have you heard that in this context with respect to the soul at all? Some of you have. Good. Well, that's what we're going to try to squash into the ground pretty strongly and firmly. First of all, I want to get into what exactly knowledge means, because knowledge does not mean scientific discoveries. That's not a synonym for knowledge. Knowledge literally just means justified or grounded, true belief. So if you have a belief, how many times have you been wrong about a certain belief?
Never.
You hush. Incorrect, sir. We've all been wrong about a lot of things. And it's at the level of beliefs. Because what happens usually is we think that we have a justified belief. And justification here, don't think of this in terms of justified in salvation or anything like that. It's not a salvific term here. This literally just means reasons, or sufficient good reasons for believing. So you may have a belief that you think is true, and you have reasons for it, but then you find out that either your reasons are wrong, or there are better reasons for the alternative. And you figure out that actually you're not correct. But rarely do you actually go into a scientific laboratory and test that belief. That is what knowledge is. There is a way to get to knowledge through science, but there are also ways of getting to knowledge through just everyday reasoning. And it doesn't always have to do with science. And I'm going to get more and more into that too. We're not done. So, many people today view science as the sole source of truth. That is the dominating worldview in our world today. That would say, and I get this at the Community College of Aurora often, where people will say, well, this is a really nice idea, and I would really be happy if this were true, but you can't prove it through science. I get that frequently. And first of all, what I love to say, and this is for those of you who may be more philosophically adept, so if you don't get it, don't worry about it right now. But basically, here's the idea, that a proof implies some degree of certainty, which don't quibble with whether or not certainty admits of degrees right now, but it implies something like certainty. In science, what we do is we test, retest, test again, test another time, and keep testing until you get enough data to then say, it is highly probable, based on the data, that I can conclude something about this test period, about all these tests. So if you're testing whether or not frogs boil in water over a slow period of time or quickly, you have to do it a lot and test your data, and then you have to work through situations where you lost track of the frog, or maybe you put the frog in the water and you forgot, or you put the frog in the pot and forgot the water. Things like that. But overall, you have to say, generally, maybe 90% of the time, my test worked. Therefore, your conclusion. So what this is considered to be a scientific proof, and it is far from certain. The reason is because there may be some things that happened in your lab that someone else figures out that you did wrong that invalidates your whole argument. So in science, this is the world of certainty, supposedly, and you cannot get absolute certainty in science. But, shocker, you can get it in philosophy. You can get absolute certainty in philosophy. This is called a deductive argument. This is something that argues something like this. Socrates, or all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, what?
Socrates is mortal.
Right. You can't prove otherwise unless you quibble with those first two arguments, those first two premises. So the ironic thing here is that people who fight the immaterial world or fight the non-scientific world as a source of knowledge are expecting certainty in science where they cannot get it. So that should frustrate you, that this view that science is the sole source of knowledge is so prevalent right now. It is a source of knowledge, yes, but it is not the source of knowledge. Furthermore, here's another reason this is so wrong. What is being said if I say the only way you can get knowledge is through scientific processes, or the scientific method?
That's not a scientifically proven.
Yes. It's dead. Just killed it. That view can't work because it cannot live by its own set of rules. So already this view that does not want to deal with the soul or anything immaterial as possible knowledge, it doesn't work. So knowledge has to be a lot wider of a span than this. Yeah.
I've always thought that science really good science doesn't seek to prove. A good scientist seeks to disprove.
That is a falsification theory, and that's a question of the philosophy of science. But most scientists even won't say that they're out to prove. But for some reason, that's the language that has crept into popular culture, is it's proved by science. Well, what science? What scientist? Because there are disagreements in science. So who wins? Is there king scientist that maybe is reigning for a certain period of time until he dies and we go with him? Or is there a president of the science club, global international science club, that maybe makes the decisions and arbitrates disagreements? So there's this strange science worship going on that cannot be founded, and this is called scientism. And where scientism comes from, this is a theory of knowledge, which is an epistemology, and where scientism comes from is the view called naturalism, or physicalism, actually. It's that view that says that everything is nature, everything is physical, material. There is nothing outside of that. So, where did you come from? Well, nothing created you other than material stuff, material accidental occurrences. This is the naturalistic view. And it makes sense that scientism would come out of that, because where do you get anything like the soul, the immaterial world, if all you have is dirt, rocks, water? Even if we start with some kind of maybe moving amoeba or something like that, well, when does it become aware of itself? At what point does just kind of a squirting around little amoeba or bug or something become a self-reflective being that says, I'm going to really work on my appearance today, or I'm going to really, I am a very mean bug, and I need to try to be a nice bug to the other bugs, so that maybe I can help them along. When did it do that? How do you say that natural processes alone all of a sudden just gave birth to something that cannot be explained materialistically? That's getting something from nothing. That's like getting a pet, a real pet, out of a rock, instead of a pet rock out of a rock. It's not possible, because you have to get the immaterial from something immaterial. Okay, so naturalism and scientism are what lead to the physicalist view of the soul, that there is no real soul, that anytime we talk about a soul, what we mean is whatever's going on in the brain. Okay, makes sense? Questions or comments or bailouts? Okay, stop me at any point. One of the things that I don't want to make this sound like is that we don't care about science at all, because anytime you are pursuing truth, you need to look anywhere truth might surface. You need to look at any area that may yield good information. We don't want to say that, well, we know the truth, and science generally says that we're completely out of our minds and wrong, and then we don't want to say, and that doesn't matter. We want to say, no, that does matter, that the vast majority of science seems to have a different view, but that doesn't mean we have to agree with it. It just means we need to analyze it fairly and hold our own view up to the microscope and see if it works. Because I don't know about you, but what I am not interested in is defending a false belief system. I have no interest in that. I have no interest in being a Christian if it's not true. Why am I wasting my time? It's not easy being a Christian. So if it is false, I want to know. If it is true, I want to know. So I'm not going to turn away from science, but I am going to recognize the limits of science. So what we're going to primarily find whenever we do look at science is what science can't tell us. We'll look at science for maybe evidence of certain things, and then we'll keep finding time and time again that there are parts of the human person that science not just hasn't found answers to, but is incapable of finding answers to. And here's an example of the incapability of science. If there is an immaterial part of the human, meaning it's not matter, it's not atoms, it's not something that you can weigh or get a transplant with or something like that, so how can material testing processes ever test it? You cannot, that is philosophically and scientifically impossible. So if there is such a thing as the immaterial, we have to come to know it philosophically, not scientifically. Yes, sir?
Just to be clear, when you talk about material, you're talking about both matter and energy that we could measure in terms of like electromagnetism.
Yeah, because there you have electrons, neutrons. I mean, there's still, it's at a different level of visibility, but it's still physical.
Right. Okay.
There's still something actually happening in the physical world. Right. So if you're talking about something that is immaterial, then like your thought about wanting to make a sandwich when you get home, you know, that's not something that you're actually going to be able to submit for scientific study somewhere. That's yours. Your thought about what's hopefully your sandwich. So science can't tell us how we feel. It can tell us maybe some things that may make scientists think that we're feeling a certain way or suspect, but we have to confirm it. So if you ever have been a part of a brain scan or a brain scan study or anything like that, which when I went to Colorado State University, and there were always psychological studies going on where they would hook people up to various scanners and things that would measure heart rate and physiological responses to scary movies or cute puppy videos or things like that. And there would be certain things happening on the brain scans, but the person conducting the research would actually have to ask the person scanned if they were feeling a certain way and have to be confirmed. They would have to actually have the individual describe what was going on. It wasn't just appearing in the brain scan. Science also can't measure your desires. It can't weigh your desires. If you desperately would rather be in bed right now, there is no way for anyone to tell that, other than maybe that it is feasible for science to get to the point where we could test your level of exhaustion. But what you could not do is say, and what we also see is, in addition to this person being tired, we're also seeing this person thinking about being in bed. That's a different type, that's a different category of activity that's going on. It's related and distinct.
I feel like it's arguing from ignorance, so what if they did discover some sort of tool that could measure that?
That would be really interesting.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that if we become convinced that there is an immaterial part of the self, then it is impossible for something that's truly immaterial to be actually discoverable through science. So that's something that we don't always, that's hard to think through, because that is the kind of reasoning that we are not used to. We're not used to saying science can't. And science can't. It just can't do everything. You can't test the mental faculties of a rock. There are just certain things you can't do. All right. This ultimately then is not science versus religion. This is a question of simply truth. What is true? What is the best explanation? So both sides use scientific reasoning, but the commitment to science is what's going to differ. The physicalist side has a tendency to say, well, maybe science can't explain a whole lot, but let's just give it time. Let's just wait. And then eventually, we will get to be able to see the sandwich that is floating around in your head somewhere. Well, that is why you're here, to see if that actually is going to be possible or not. So you'll leave here less afraid of mind-reading technology, I hope, at the end of 7 weeks, because I don't think it's possible. But that you have to figure that out for yourself too. So in order to find truth, since that's our goal, we have to use good arguments. This is not a matter of saying, well, I'm a Christian, therefore the soul exists. That's not what we're interested in doing. We're actually interested in figuring out, is this true? So we have to analyze good arguments, and one of the consequences of that means that there are people who we want desperately to agree with, who maybe had a good conclusion that we agreed with, and the argument doesn't work. Or the argument is lazy, or maybe the argument doesn't take certain things into account that it ought to take into account. So part of this reasoning requires the maturity to be able to say that just because I like someone, or just because I agree with someone, or just because I go to their church, doesn't mean they've just made a good persuasive argument. What we want to do is find the absolute best arguments and weigh them against the alternative. Not just arguments that you agree with, but the absolute best ones. The best explanation is something that we're after. So there will be a point in certain arguments in any field that you study where you don't have the option of absolute logical certainty about a conclusion. You have to lay out the options and say, I now have to decide what the best explanation is. And if you don't have enough information, then keep gathering information until a best explanation emerges. So we're not entirely after certainty, absolute logical certainty, all the time. But where we can't get that, we are after the best explanation. So that's either going to be that we are dualist in nature, or that we are physicalist in nature. And that really covers it, actually, because you're either comprised of immaterial and material, or I guess the other option would be you're all immaterial. But we're not going to go there. That has to do with the dependence on, or the reliability of your senses about the external world. And if you're interested in that, let's have coffee sometime, because I have an argument for it. But so why does any of this matter? The assumption is, yes, it does matter. I mean, that's kind of a leading question there. Well, why does it matter? I'm assuming that you know that it does matter, but here are some of the reasons why. First of all, it does combat naturalism. And naturalism, which again says that everything that exists is purely of the natural, physical, material world. This is a view that poisons far more than just the soul discussion. It's something that causes people to think that anything religious or philosophical or anything in the humanities is completely subjective, meaning you make it up, or it's up to you to make truth, come up with the truth for yourself. It's whatever causes you to feel meaning in your life, those sorts of things. That comes out of naturalism. Because if naturalism holds where everything is physical, then anything that you think through that is not made up of matter is not a candidate for knowledge. It's not a candidate for anything that is firm and objective, meaning true for everyone. So I am extremely anxious to kill naturalism, as you can see, partly because there are so many things to know and to be known that are essential to life and essential to human flourishing that have nothing to do with the natural world, or little to do with the natural world. Or at least don't start there. So, if naturalism is true, if physicalism is true specifically, there's no life after death. You're done. You die, you turn into dirt, to dust, worm food. That is it. If there is an immaterial realm, if dualism is true, then there is at least a possibility of you surviving death. So this matters, if you at least have any interest in surviving death. And if you're interested in counseling others who are afraid of death, or who are unsure what to think about death. The existence of the consciousness is another reason why this matters, provides a reason to believe in God. And again, going back to my entire discussion of why you can't get the immaterial out of the material, purely out of the material, this is why. I mean, this is where that was pointing to. That if you can't get the immaterial out of the material, and yet the immaterial is here, then you have to ask where it came from. And the best explanation for that is some kind of supernatural creator, some kind of creator that is immaterial in nature, that gave birth to more immaterial beings. Make sense? Okay, so this is actually an argument for God. So an argument for life after death, an argument for God, who will greet you after death. This is someone that you need to, if he's there, we need to figure out who he is, and this view puts us, or the dualist view, puts us squarely on the path to figuring out who he is. Because the next question after he exists is, who is he? This also helps us determine the meaning of life. So if there is a possibility of surviving death, if there is more to you than this life, then all of a sudden, this life is not quite as meaningless. There may be something that if you survive this, if you survive death, and you carry on, and you live in some kind of other way, then this life causes you to look forward to that. Or at least causes you to figure out what's next, so that you can then ask, how should I be living now in order to make that transition, or in order to figure out what sort of person I should be then, or in order to figure out what kind of God is on the other side over there and what he wants from me now. Those sorts of things. It also affects our ethics, and there's a strange capital letter there that should be a lowercase, voluntary letter. Just never mind that. But it affects our ethics because we are frequently trying to figure out what to do about unplugging people from a ventilator. Or if you are familiar with the Terry Schiavo case, where she had partial brain death. She was not diagnosed with what's called whole brain death, which is where your entire brain is inactive. She was partially brain dead, and the majority of her body was functioning. She just couldn't, so she wasn't entirely conscious. She couldn't chew and swallow food. She couldn't swallow drinks. So she was not hooked up to a ventilator. She was not hooked up to any heart machines, anything like that. The only thing she was hooked up to was a feeding tube and an IV for fluids. So the pulling the plug on Terry Schiavo was just removing food and water. It was starving her, and it was dehydrating her to death. So that is permissible under what circumstance? What has to be true in order for that to be ethically permissible?
Brain dead.
Total brain dead. And there being nothing there. And it's even then, you wonder, if you believe in the immaterial part of the self, you wonder if there's something else going on that you can't detect in brainwaves. And so I would argue that that's not permissible under the dualistic view at all. But it is permissible under the physicalistic view that says that all there is the brain. All there is the physical. So if you cannot detect brain waves, then there is no reason to think that the person's still around. But here's what's interesting, is recently there's been a person who woke up from that same situation. That happened before too. This is not just a one-time thing. This person was diagnosed with the same problem that Terry Schiavo had. She was in a coma for, I think, 15 years, or in that state for 15 years, something like that. This other guy, I don't know how long it was, but it was a very long time. And he woke up. They thought he was never going to wake up. They had considered pulling all these life support options. And he remembered things that were said to him while he was in that state. And they couldn't detect it. So this matters ethically. It is of deep significance. There's also the question about physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. What do you do in those sorts of situations? Well, if there is no life after death, if there's no hope for the future after death, and if all that exists is in this life, then by all means, if you're miserable, go ahead and bump off. Because why not, right? If you're miserable and you're not going to get better, then why hang around? But if you're a dualist, if you do believe that there is an immaterial component of the self, that you have a soul, that it's not just your physiological, biological occurrences that make up who you are and what you are, then your pain, your misery may actually have a purpose that you may not be aware of. And beyond the immediate purpose, which we probably aren't aware of, I don't know very many people who are aware of their own purpose of suffering. But even if that is bunk, then at the very least, you aren't just here to enjoy your own life. You may actually be here for a greater, as part of a greater whole and more of a continuity. So death occurs, but you're not done then. So if you just hurry it up, then maybe you're missing out on something. If you, on the flip side of this, if you do believe that you know what is happening after death, if you believe that that you will meet your Creator, that you will be in a glorified state, that you will be in a better place after death, then maybe ethically that would cause you and your loved ones to simply not prolong your life as long as possible. Maybe do what you can, and then at a certain point be able and give yourself permission to let go. So this has a bunch of ethical implications to it, depending on where we land. Any questions on that so far? We don't have time to get into any of it, really, but it's at least showing why it matters. Okay. This is another reason that this matters, that if we are at all interested in figuring out what our purpose is here, what it looks like to be a spiritually mature person, then you have to know something about the spiritual world, something about the spiritual dimension. You have to know what sort of thing you are. You may be dualistic, but you may not necessarily know what that looks like or what that means or what the soul is for. But if you're at least at that first step where you say, I'm convinced that I'm a body and a soul together, then the second step is, what is the best source of information on this? And how do I figure out what sort of thing I am and am meant to be? And that's when we have to look outside of scientific textbooks, because if science can't tell us much about the immaterial, because it's fundamentally material, then there has to be something else out there that's a source of information. And generally speaking, if you have books such as the Bible that purport to show you where you came from and where you are going and what the point of life is and who this Creator is and what in the world He wants from you, then that's a pretty good place to start. And you have more reason to start there because it talks about the soul all over the place, and now you're convinced that there's a soul. So all of a sudden, it vindicates what the Bible says. So there's even more reason to take it seriously. Thoughts or questions? I'll give you the last 10 minutes to just talk.
I have a question. So all my friends are geeks, and we watch Star Trek together, and the question that keeps coming up over and over is, if there's a soul and you're in a transporter, if you get transported to a new place, what happens to your soul? Oh, it's like, put back in your body. It's a great conversation, but I don't even know how to engage it. So,
well, you can say this, that if the soul is immaterial and a transporter dematerializes you, then there's no reason it should do anything to your soul.
yeah.
Because it can't touch it.
Ah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Yep, transporter objection failure. Any other questions or thoughts? Yes, sir.
So a good example may be, like in seeing, for instance, like a physicalist would say that your eyes see, a dualist would say that you see through your eyes. Would that be accurate?
That's a really good way of putting that. There are different physicalist accounts of what happens when you see, and they're not just physicalist accounts, but some physicalists may be what's called a direct realist, where they say you literally see the carpet. The carpet somehow, in some way, jumps into your eyes and you see that. But most physicalists would say something like what's called indirect realism, where some kind of image of that hits the mirror of your eyes, and there's something physiological that goes on there. But then they would still say there's some interpretation that goes on, but they would say we just don't know exactly what that looks like. Then the dualist would say that that all happens, but then there's another step where you can reflect on it. This is what a philosopher, actually I don't know if he's technically, I think he is technically a philosopher. His name's Justin Barrett. Do you know if he's technically a philosopher, if that's what his title, his PhD is?
No.
But he believes in what's called metacognition, which is one level of thinking, which is, for example, I see carpet. And then metacognition is thoughts about my seeing carpet. So if I say, I see carpet, and carpet hit my eyes, and I'm seeing through my eyes, like you said, then the metacognition level would say, maybe, I really don't like that carpet. Or, why am I paying attention to carpet? Or, clearly I'm bored, or something like that. That's the kind of, that's that other tier of reasoning that the physicalist would not be able to really account for.
Right,
And-
like you could look at the carpet and say, I see that that carpet is brown, but you could still, if you didn't have the ability to see, you could still understand brown.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that is one of those pesky non-physical components of our reasoning.
Yeah, you don't need your eyes to understand.
Right. Understanding is not a sense. It's not one of the five senses.
And that's not scientifically measurable, right?
Right. Your performance on exams is measurable, but your performance on exams, if anybody's taken a multiple choice exam, that does not test your understanding. That tests your ability to memorize or your ability to bluff, or if you're like me, who blew off my SAT in high school, I was drawing designs with the little bubbles at a certain point. Don't do that. You pay for it, and you try to undo it for the rest of your life. But it's not something that your understanding is not purely material. But again, there's a connection there, because we do know that if you first start a very difficult class, your brain feels stretched, your mind is tired, you may have a difficult time following, but then it's scientifically shown in a lot of studies that your brain adapts. If you push yourself, if you are maybe not a very good listener and you push yourself and discipline yourself to do it, your brain physically strengthens and changes. So there is a connection there, like you were saying, Stacey, that there's kind of a line that's a bit of a blurred line, and they interact. But again, we're not, at this stage, we're not trying to say how they interact. We're just simply saying that they are different. So that's stage one. But these are extremely important things that are going to come up more and more in the coming weeks. Any other thoughts? Yes, sir.
You said that Moreland does make a distinction between soul and spirit. Yes. Okay. Does he in this book unpack from Scripture why he believes that to be the case?
I don't think so. I have never heard him unpack that and explain it in greater detail. I know he probably does, because I don't think he would say anything that he doesn't have adequate grounds for. But I don't think there's any reason to do that if you believe that the soul encompasses all of our immaterial facets. I just don't see any reason to say, and then there's this other corner of life where we're spiritual. Because that would imply then that maybe that's something that doesn't involve knowledge, or something that doesn't involve the emotions, or maybe it's all emotion. I don't know, but I don't. You'd have to do some gymnastics, some mental gymnastics, to separate out the spirit, I think, from all of that, and I don't see it anywhere in Scripture.
So you think when he and people like him do this in his camp on this particular issue, that it's it might be more of just like a semantic shorthand
That's my
it's
suspicion.
convenience to use two words to talk about different aspects?
That's my
for him?
suspicion.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think that he literally thinks that there's this other spiritual dimension that is where all of our spirituality lives. But I'm not entirely clear on what he does mean.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I've always heard, well not always, but that when you become a Christian, when you're born again, all of a sudden this part of you that was dead becomes alive, and that's your spirit. And I don't know exactly what that is, but.
Ooh, I would just say it's the regenerate immaterial self, the regenerate soul. It's you being all of a sudden stamped with justification, saved out of slavery to sin. So I don't think that all of a sudden we become hyper-spiritual. I don't know of any examples of that have lasted very long. Instead, it is a seal of our salvation. It's being indwelt by the Holy Spirit. So it's His Spirit, maybe, not
We gain a
not
brand new.
this new facet of the self. We don't lose our identity, we don't become someone else, we become who we were more like, or at least on the track to who we were meant to be originally, apart from
Sarah,
the
he
fall.
does make a bit of a distinction.
Oh, does he? Good.
Between mind and spirit on 140, 141. It says they're not ontological. Two additional faculties of the soul are of critical importance. The mind is that faculty of the soul that contains thoughts and beliefs, along with the relevant abilities to have them. It is with my mind that I think, and my mind contains my beliefs. The spirit is that faculty of the soul through which the person relates to God.
Right, okay, that sounds more like what I heard him say, but I still don't think that really is warranted. I think that the mind is more general than just your hyper-rationality, or you can actually relate with your mind. You can build relationships with your mind. Not strictly, it requires another being, right? But you also reason through relationships. You think about this other person. You think about how you relate to this other person. So I'm not sure that I still don't think that works, but that's up to you to figure out. Yes?
If you consider it rather than as a separate processing center, another source of perception. Hearing is not seeing, so you have the separation of the mind and the spirit, because the spirit is that which has the capacity for perception of God,
Right.
that the mind would then be able to process to build the relationship.
But see, what I'm saying is I don't think that I'm willing to narrow the mind down that much. I'm not willing to say that the mind lacks that capacity. So I don't see a need to add another facet, if that makes sense. So I think that the mind has more happening than simply academic reasoning or anything like that. Yeah.
I think it might be helpful for us to understand where he's coming from, where on page 141, he says the spirit is that faculty of the soul. So he's referring to it as sort of a subcomponent of
Yeah,
the soul.
right.
Just for ease of talking about that part of the immaterial self, it sounds like.
Yeah, but it's still a question of, is that warranted?
Yeah, is it necessary to make the separation?
Right.
I think what makes it even more confusing is people use the terms spirit and soul, it just,
Right.
to mean
Well,
the same thing, and so that just.
and usually they are considered to be the same thing. So that's why here, I'm not as interested in breaking it down into its different parts. I'm strictly interested in, is there an immaterial self at all, period? And whatever you determine is in there is another discussion. But the category is what has to be defended, the category of the immaterial, because that's what's under fire right now. Yeah.
I'm just looking at D
Mhm.
and 3 about ethics. I had a conversation recently with an individual who had some pretty profound disabilities, and we were talking about end-of-life decisions. And he had a very interesting reaction. He said that he believes that God has measured our days, and our death is our death, our life is our life. And we can wrestle with these issues, but we will always ultimately reach the right decision.
Ooh,
And I thought, wow, something to think about.
that is interesting. But let me ask you this, let's go back to the Exodus, where Moses was trying to get the Hebrews out of Egypt, out of slavery. And God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and Pharaoh was against them leaving after he initially said yes, and then he changed his mind and sent his troops after them. God used that to show his power, because when they got to the Red Sea, he opened the Red Sea for his people, and then he closed it on the enemies and drowned them. So, if you believe in the sovereignty of God, you believe that he really did harden Pharaoh's heart, actively, and he really did drown them on purpose, and he knew that was going to happen. So, was Pharaoh right in going after them? I would say that there is still what we read in there, even if it's a difficult passage to understand why God did this or what God was thinking, Pharaoh still seems to be on the hook. He still seems to be considered evil at that point, or acting in an evil way. So just because God can redeem a bad situation doesn't make it less bad. It doesn't make it less evil. It just means that he's capable of redeeming any sort of situation and working through any sort of situation, good or bad. But
I think this individual is talking about for him, you know, and not so much for Pharaoh from his point of view, but you know, from his perspective, that, you know, no matter what kind of discussions that were going on about end-of-life care and things like that, ultimately for him, it would be the correct outcome.
Well, but what I'm saying is, if you go back to the Pharaoh example, I'm using that as a counterexample, as an example of why it doesn't make sense to say just because something will happen and is planned, that God planned it, that doesn't make it, that doesn't give me the moral freedom to do whatever I want. It doesn't mean that I'm off the hook morally. So if that was true, then suicide would be permissible. If that was true, then suicide bombing would be permissible. There would be any number of things that would be permissible if that were the case. But what we have to ask is not what can I get away with, but instead, what is the best use of my life and the way to live that actually reflects who I was meant to be and submits to my Creator. So I think philosophically that's problematic. I think that theologically it's problematic. But the reason that I brought Pharaoh in was just to say, even if God actively says, or actively hardens our heart, somehow in the narrative we still look guilty. So there's still a component of responsibility to do the right thing, even in the worst scenarios, the worst conceivable scenarios. Doesn't make it easy at all. It just, I think, does imply that there is a right, there is a way to go out well, and there is a way to go out poorly. So let's go ahead and end, because we're 5 minutes over. Those were great questions. Thank you for coming. It was a good amount of people.